Welcome, engineers. My name's TravisIQ, and today we're talking security controls, the types of controls that you can put on the business, the users, the physical infrastructure to ensure that you have a secure environment. Let's go! Join me in the void as we begin this technical discussion. First and foremost, I wanted to talk briefly about the types of security controls that I'm going to go over in this lecture: physical, technical, and administrative controls. And now there are a number of different controls, specific control types within these control definitions, and I'm going to give you a few examples of each one, and then in the next video I will actually give you some sample exam questions that would emulate a certification exam that you might be familiar with. So the first control type that we're going to be talking about is a physical control. Physical control. Examples here would be something like a turnstile, or something like a rotating door, or other doors, man traps, one in, one out doors. These are examples of physical controls that control access, user access, to your physical infrastructure. A security guard might also be another example of a physical control. You might say, well, Travis, we actually changed the definitions, or we had more definitions in the previous slide that you talked about. Couldn't a security guard be an example of some other control type? They actually could. We're not going to go over this specific control type, but there are things like deterrent controls. So security guard, while they could actually physically stop you from entering a facility, they also act as a deterrent, right? If you were to see a security guard, you would say, oh, maybe I shouldn't try and enter that physical space. There are other physical control types. So we talked about turnstiles here and security guards. What about things like cable locks? Locking cabinets. These are all examples of physical infrastructure that prevent people from coming in and physically stealing devices that are racked and stacked, physically stealing laptops typically when we think about cable locks. So a physical control is absolutely a valuable control that you can implement as a security control in your environment, and 100% necessary. The next control type that I'd like to discuss is a technical control. So technical controls are implemented in software. And so an example of a technical control would be something like a password to access a device. That's implemented in the software that prevents you from bringing up a terminal, or prevents you from bringing up a graphical user interface, a GUI, a GUI, without the proper authority to do so, asking you for a username and password. We could also have different levels of secure access. So we could have guest users, traditional users, administrators, privileged users, and we could implement these user profiles. They would all fall under technical controls because we are implementing them in software, and that software implementation is actually securing our environment and making it more difficult to do things. Another example of a security control, now I'm pointing to the router in the center of this infrastructure, but we could apply passwords to clients. We could apply passwords to mobile devices with some mobile device management solution. But there are a pile of different technical controls, and you will see as I continue out this lecture series that I will identify a lot of technical controls within Active Directory, within your graphical user interfaces, within your iOS, your Internet Working Operating System for Cisco devices, or JuneOS, or things like this. So there are a number of ways to implement these technical controls. But another good example would be something like, how about an access control list on a firewall, for example? An access control list is a list of permit and deny statements that's implemented in software that says, hey, this type of traffic with this source and this destination and this TCP packet type or this TCP flag should be allowed through. And this traffic with this source and this destination and this TCP destination port or TCP port source port should not be allowed through. And so there are a number of other technical controls that we can implement. I've actually done a video on another technical control, a technical security control like port security or 802.1x or port-based access control. These are different, and I've described the differences. I'll link that video in the description below. Finally, we have one last control type that I would really like to discuss, which is administrative controls. This is where the policies and files and infrastructure for those administrative controls would live. So what's the difference, Travis, between these security controls, like your physical controls or your technical controls, and administrative controls? I'll give you a really clear example. The difference between the other two control types in this is an administrative control is a policy. These are written definitions that then define the other control types. Let me give you an example. If I were to say our organization has a policy that requires users to change their password every 90 days. That is an administrative control. The key word to that term is policy. An administrative control is a written policy or definition that then defines how we implement the control in our infrastructure. If I said that I clicked a box, an Active Directory box, or I used a drop-down menu, or I set a password requirement in Active Directory that said every 90 days a user's password should require a reset from each independent user, now I'm actually setting a technical control in the software that makes the user reset their password. That's a technical control. Let me give you one more example that makes this even more confusing if I were to talk about a certification exam, for example. In certification exams, there might be a question that says, and I'll present a question like this in my next video, there might be a question that says, users are required to change their password every 90 days as a result of the policy set in place by IntelliGenceQuest business. As a result of this policy implementation, we have set the 90-day requirement flag in all of our administrative management software. What best exemplifies this security control? And then you're like, Travis, the security control defines both a technical security control and an administrative security control. And I would argue that the policy is what they said defined everything. That in that question, the policy defined all of the infrastructure changes, and then they just gave you an example of the infrastructure change that was made. So what best describes the statement that was made is actually an administrative control, not a technical control, even though a technical control was also described. I'll give you some examples of this in the certification exam questions when I go over that in the next video, which I always publish after I give you these definitions. But for now, that's sufficient. I'd like to point out one last thing that I don't actually have a slide for, but I just wanted to make a note of. And that is, in a lot of these certification exams, they actually use two terms, administrative and managerial controls. And administrative and managerial controls are actually very similar. The administrative controls typically define set policies that then apply explicitly to underlying technical or physical controls. We need to have a security guard manning 24/7. That's a policy. And then the act of implementing a security guard 24/7 is the physical infrastructure, the physical control. A managerial control typically is defined to meet specific GRC requirements, or governance, risk, and compliance requirements. So a managerial control might say that we need a chief information security officer that then oversees intermediate vice presidents of specific security domains within our infrastructure. Does that really sound like a written policy that defines a technical control? No. It's really more of a managerial infrastructure, and that would be considered a managerial control, but it's really not as useful. And although they kind of get used interchangeably, and I wanted to make that definition for you here now, I think that the term administrative control is much more valuable, especially from a certification exam standpoint. While this might not be the most interesting and crazy of topics, I think it is extremely valuable and very testable, especially if you're looking for a certification exam, and as you move up the ranks in terms of your security job and roles and titles. These definitions will be more valuable to you because they are really important when we apply them to our infrastructure. I hope you find that valuable and interesting. Check out the exam questions in the subsequent video, and as is always the case, engineer, break stuff, have fun, let's go!